Okay, dear students, today we are going to start with our lecture number 19 of psycholinguistics, which is a continuation of the topic that we discussed in the previous lecture. Now, today, continuing that lecture, we were discussing about the brain and how the brain processes the language, and how and in which parts of the brain the major areas where the language is processed. So we were talking about two parts in the brain. So where there is, scientists have discovered that the language is processed there. So the left hemisphere is particularly implicated in language processing. So when we are discussing about how the brain processes language, then we are also talking about the different areas of the brain. So if we see brain lateralization, though the right contributes as well. So in this, like if we consider this point, then the left hemisphere, the left side of the brain, is particularly implicated in language processing. And though the right side also contributes in processing the language. Now, the vast network of connections between the two ensures that any operation can draw upon both. So whatever thoughts go in our mind, or whatever storage system we have in our brain, be it working memory or permanent memory, there is a vast network of connections between the two sections of the brain, which is processing the left and the right, which is processing the language, and they can that any operation can draw upon both. That any speech or any act can draw upon both the left or the right side for processing the language. Now, the hemispheres have a contralateral relationship with the rest of the body. Now, the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body and vice versa. So what we say is that the hemispheres have a contralateral relationship. That means with the rest of the body, they have a relationship with the rest of the body. And the right side of the brain will control the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain will control the right side of the body. So in a way, it's not like the left would control the left side of the body or the right would control the right. So it's vice versa. It's crosswords. So if the left side is controlling the right side of the body, then signals received by the right ear have a preferential link to the left hemisphere and vice versa. So whatever signals we are receiving on our right side of the ear will have a link to the brain on the left side, and similar for the other situation. So however, the situation with the eyes is less straightforward. Information from the left visual field in both eyes is transmitted to the right hemisphere and vice versa. So however, the situation with the eye is less straightforward. That means that the connection of our visual eyesight is different, and information from the left visual field in both eyes is transmitted to the right hemisphere. So from the left side it is transferred, from both eyes the left side would be transferred to the right hemisphere, and from the right visual field of the both eyes together would be transferred to the left hemisphere. So the upper surface of the brain, the cortex, is especially associated with language processing. So mainly language is processed through the cortex, though the subcortical areas also contribute. Now the main language is being processed through the cortex of the brain, but then there are subcortical areas also that contribute in it. Now the cortex is marked by a pattern of hills, which are called gyri, and valleys, which are called sulci. So the cortex would be marked by patterns of hills and valleys, like up and downs, some of the deeper sulci or the valleys divide each hemisphere into 4 parts. So some parts you see a brain is divided into 4 sections. Now these are the temporal lobe, which runs from front to back. Now the occipital and parietal lobes at the back and categorized as posterior, and the frontal lobe sometimes described as anterior. So the occipital lobe is associated with visual stimuli and the temporal lobe with auditory stimuli. So the occipital would be only with our vision, and the temporal lobe will deal with the auditory stimuli. Now a strip running centrally across the hemisphere controls much motor activity, including operations involving the articulators. So other linguistic functions are associated with some of the lower level of the brain. So a strip that is running centrally across the hemisphere controls the motor activities, our skills, our motor skills, including involving the articulators also. So other linguistic functions are associated with some lower level of the brain. The medulla regulates involuntary activities, including breathing, and the cerebellum plays a major part in controlling and coordinating articulation. So the transmission of information in the brain takes place by means of nerve cells or neurons. So the transmission of information, the brain takes place would be in the nerve cells, which are called the neurons. The human brain contains about 100 billion of neurons. So the power of the brain derives not so much from the activity of individual neurons as from the multiple interconnections between them and the way in which they operate in parallel. So there are 100 billion neurons in our brain, they're nerve cells, and all of the activity is divided individually. It's not like just separate one or 2 neurons are allotted to do such and such or control such and such activity. It's like the connection between the neurons. So the connection or the link between the neurons and them working in a parallel form is how the activity is focused and how the brain would derive the power to say go ahead with any operation. So the human cortex contains about 3/4 of the brain's neurons and is proportionately much bigger than the cortex in other mammals. So in other mammals, the cortex is not as huge as in a human brain, and the cortex in the human brain is about 3/4, so 3/4 of the brain, and it has all the neurons. 3/4 of the part of the neurons are inside the cortex. So that means then the cortex has the major control. So information is transmitted within the brain by the discharge of a chemical across a synapse, a gap between neurons, which causes a change in the receiving neuron. So the change may involve an increase in the neuron's electrical potential, termed excitatory, or a decrease, termed inhibitory. So there could be, like, information would be transmitted from the brain by the discharge of a chemical process which is called synapse. It's a gap between the neurons, and it causes the neurons to change in while they are receiving the motor skills or whatever notifications they're getting from our brain. Now the change they're saying that involves an increase in the neuron electrical potential. So the electrical potential of a neuron is called the excitatory, or let's say, the decrease in the electrical potential would be termed inhibitory. So it accumulates until it reaches a threshold, until it reaches a point that it has to stop. Now, when it triggers a pulse or action potential, which is transmitted along the neuron and on to others, so it would accumulate until it reaches a threshold, that means a point on which it would trigger a pulse or an action potential that would allow us to perform an action, which is transmitted along through the neuron and on to, from one neuron to all the other neurons. Now, the transmission can potentially take place on a massive scale. So small effects can become greatly magnified. So even a small effect of it would be greatly magnified, and it could take on a huge scale or a huge amount of transmission. Now, this pattern of activity is referred to as activation and has provided an influential model of how words are accessed from the lexicon during listening or reading. So the pattern of activity is referred to as the activation, and it will provide influential model of how the words are accessed from the lexicon during listening or reading, when we're reading or when we're listening. So when we then further study the brain as human versus animal, now we want to see the difference. How does the human brain operate differently from an animal's brain? So it may be that human beings have developed language when other species have not, because the human brain operates in distinctive ways. It's maybe because it's different. So hence an interest in discovering how our brain differs physically from those of other creatures, including their primates. So it's an interest in discovering of how our brain would differ and how it would physically be different from those of other creatures, including their primates, or let's say that the other animals of the same species captured together or living together. So the critical difference is not one of brain capacity. Elephants and whales have larger brains than human beings. So it's not about the size of the brain, it's how the brain functions. So mice have a greater brain-body ratio, and a number of rodents and small mammals have denser neural connections. Now, the discussion therefore focuses on whether the human brain is different in certain of its components, in its structure and in the way it develops. So it was once surmised that a locus for an innate language faculty might be found in the left hemisphere of the human brain. So once we did, they had this research that an inbuilt capability for language could be found in the left hemisphere of the human brain. Now, it is in this hemisphere that for most humans, functions involving syntax and lexes appear to become lateralized. And it was noted that the left hemisphere is often larger than the right. So, however, the same kind of left hemisphere dominance has been found in several other species, including birds. Now, the operation of language is currently envisaged as being very widely distributed in the brain. So it's the operation of how the language is used, or how it's properly distributed in the brain. Now, with many different areas, including some in the right hemisphere, contributing cognitive and motor subskills. So sometimes we see that how is language distributed in the brain, so we would say that it includes also the right hemisphere also, not only just the left. And in the right side, that would contribute to the cognitive or the motor skills, motor subskills. So attention has focused on specific areas of the human brain which are markedly larger relative to the whole organ than the equivalent areas in other primate brains. So sometimes attention would be focused on specific areas of the human brain, and they would be marked larger relatively to the whole organ, and then any other equivalent area in the other primate brains. So the cortex is proportionately much greater in human beings. So we can say that the cortex is much greater in human beings because its function is much greater, and it controls more neurons. Now this is the area that controls complex operations, including making connections with stored information. Now the cortex deals with how we get a connection of when we want to retrieve information from the place where we've stored it in our brain, analyzing the input, and coordinating sophisticated muscular movements. So human prefrontal areas are up to 6 times bigger than those of chimpanzees in relation to body size. Now these areas appear to be responsible for recognizing similarities between objects and grouping them into categories. So damage there may limit the ability to perform tasks that involve seeing things from the perspective of others. So the human prefrontal areas are up to 6 times bigger than that of a chimpanzee in relation to the body size. Now these areas appear to be responsible for recognizing similarities between objects and grouping them into categories. So we can differentiate between different objects and then group them into categories by recognizing them. Now damage there may limit the ability to perform tasks that involve seeing things from the perspective of others. Damage there, if the brain is damaged in that part, then we would say that in the front cortex or the prefrontal areas, then that would limit the performance of the tasks that involve seeing things and seeing it from the perspective of others or how others would see it. Now the human cerebellum at the base of the brain is much larger. So at the back and the base of the brain, the human cerebellum is much larger relative to the brain size than in other species. So it coordinates a range of highly automatic muscular movements. In human beings, a greater proportion of the motor area is given over to the control of mouth, tongue, and jaw. So in human beings, we would say that the motor area, the most control is given to the mouth, the tongue, and the jaw for creating speech. Now human motor areas also exercise a high degree of control over the larynx, which regulates the passage of air in breathing and speech. Now in other species, the operation of the larynx is mainly or entirely controlled by the lower parts of the brain, which means that it is largely involuntarily. So control of the larynx enables us to coordinate breathing and vocalization, and is an important factor in the ability to produce speech. So we would say that in other species, the larynx would work in a totally different way, and it would be controlled by the brain, in which it means like has a large involuntarily. But the control of larynx in a human being coordinates breathing and vocalization, and is important in the factor to an ability to produce the different sounds for speech. So what also appears to distinguish human beings is brain growth in infancy. So when we look at babies, we would say that how we can distinguish it is how human beings, the brain would grow in an infant. So the ratio of brain weight to body weight resembles that of other mammals, so preternaturally, but brain weight to the body weight resembles that of other mammals with humans. So, but after birth, the brain growth in humans greatly outstrips body growth as compared with other primates. And so other primates or animals would maybe grow in body more in size than their brains. But humans, for them, if they don't even grow in the body that much, their brains will grow at a very increasing speed. Now this suggests a very different evolutionary history from other species. Now one which may uniquely have favored the development of the sophisticated cognitive processes which are a condition of language. Then we move on to brain imaging. Now brain imaging. What is brain imaging? Now methods of obtaining images of activity in the brain. So they have been used in order to determine which parts of the brain are associated with particular language tasks. So in early experiments, just to find out what part of the brain is associated with the language tasks, in early experiments, electrical stimulation of the brain, ESP, was used in order to map its operation. So they had an electrical stimulation to judge how the brain processed, or how the brain parts moved or associated themselves in different language tasks. Now by applying a lower level electrical current to an exposed area of the cortex, one can temporarily disable its associated functions. So if a low-level electrical current is given to the brain, it can temporarily dissociate all the motor functions and the speech skills. In this way, experimenters traced connections between parts of the body, including the articulators, and various points along the central strip of the cortex, which controls motor activities. So they also applied currents to the parts of the brain traditionally associated with language, and identified the language functions which were affected also. So they gave currents to the an electrical current to the part of the brain which is associated specifically with language also, and then later on they saw how the language functions were damaged or affected by it. So today, the brain can be X-rayed in sections using a method known as computerized axial tomography, or CAT scanning. So you must have heard of CAT scanning. So that is computerized axial tomography. You can X-ray the brain by that. This is useful for locating lesions, but only provides a representation of a single state. So sometimes when the lesions means like if they're having any let's say a tumor or any other wound in the brain internally, then that can be shown by this, but it would provide a representation only of a single state. Now other techniques have therefore been developed to show the brain in action from moment to moment. So other techniques are developed then to show the brain in action when exactly from one moment to the other. Now one group of methods exploits the fact that blood flow in the brain closely reflects patterns of activity because of the need to supply oxygen to the neurons which are in operation. So in positron emission tomography, PET, the PET, a small intake of radioactive gas or fluid renders the subject's blood radioactive. So the degree of radiation within the brain, and thus the intensity of blood flow, can be measured by the gamma ray detectors. So a computer picture is generated then of the metabolic activity in the brain. Bright colors showing the areas where it is at its most intense, and darker colors shows those which are less active. So even more precise images can be obtained through a technique known as functional magnetic resonance imaging of fMRI, which exploits the fact that neural activity results in an excess of oxygen in the blood in the brain. So we can say that the neural activity would result in providing more access to oxygen in the blood in the brain. And you know that if the oxygen level is less in the brain, then you would feel faint. So the oxygen level can be tracked because it results in changes in magnetic susceptibility. Now researchers are thus able to monitor the changing patterns of blood flow. An alternative technique records brain states sequentially by measuring electrical activity occurring in the brain. So electrodes are attached to the subject's scalp and indicate where a change in activity, evoked potential, takes place in response to a given stimulus, such as seeing or hearing a word. So the most common method seeks to identify event-related potentials, the ERPs, small deviations in voltage level from the normal baseline. Then we move on to brain lateralization. Now, brain lateralization, the view that one of the hemispheres of the brain has or develops a special responsibility for language. Now, brain lateralization is spelled both with an S as in American English, and the S is replaced with a Z in British English. So both of the spellings would be correct in this sense. And the view of one of the hemispheres of the brain has or develops a special responsibility for a language. So it's specifically only used for language. Now, in most human beings, language appears to be particularly associated with the left hemisphere. Evidence comes from now brain damage would be one, when the left hemisphere is damaged by an accident, a stroke, or invasive surgery. It often has a serious impact upon the victim's language. Commissurotomy. In this operation, the corpus callosum joining the two hemispheres was severe to reduce the effects of epilepsy. So patients who underwent the operation could name objects in their right field of vision connecting with the left hemisphere, but not those in their left field of vision. So when the corpus callosum was severed between the two hemispheres to try to reduce the illness of epilepsy, and the patients could see from the right side of the eyes, which was connecting to the left side of the brain, but they could not see from the left side of the eye to vision, which was connecting to the right side. Next would be VADA. Now, VADA injections of sodium amytal were once used to be activate one side of the brain prior to surgery in order to ascertain which hemisphere was the dormant one for language. It was usually the left one. So, dichotic listening. Now, when different messages are presented to the two ears, the right ear, the ear that links to the left hemisphere, usually overrides the left. So when you're in dichotic listening, you're saying that different messages are presented to the two different ears. The right side, the ear that links to the left hemisphere, would usually override or be hearing more than the left side of the ear. So the right ear appears to be dominant for speech. Now generally, but the left for music, rhythm, and intonation. Even when you put in earphones in your ears or hands-free, you can see when you're using hands-free with your mobile that you can hear more clearly from your right side of there. But in the left side, if you're playing music, the language the speech is maybe not that clear as it is in the right, but in the left side, the rhythm or the beat of the music is more clear than the right. So left would associate more with the rhythm or the beat of the music, and the right would be dominant for speech. Now, there appears to be a partial relationship between lateralization and handedness. Now, rather fewer left-handers than right-handers appear to have a dominant left hemisphere for language. So, more right-handers would have a dominant left hemisphere, but a left-hander would not. Somebody who uses his left hand. So, when damage occurs to the left hemisphere of the brain before the age of 5, the victim's power of speech sometimes recover completely, and the language dominance appears to be re-establish itself in the right hemisphere. So some researchers have concluded that the language faculty may be generally distributed at birth, and that lateralization occurs gradually as part of maturation. So some people will say that at the age of 5 or before that, if the left hemisphere of the brain is damaged, then that would the person who left hemisphere is being damaged would the speech would recover sometimes, but completely, and sometimes it would just re-establish in just the right hemisphere and wouldn't establish in the left at all. So some researchers then wanted to see how that factor works, and they concluded that the language faculty may be generally distributed at birth, and that lateralization occurs gradually as part of maturation. So as soon as you get mature, then lateralization starts occurring. So the hypothesis has been linked to the notion of a critical period. Now, first language acquisition, your native language, it is argued has to take place during the period of lateralization if complete command of L1 is to be achieved. So if you want complete command of the first native language, then you need to take place during the period of lateralization would be complete, then you'll achieve the full command over your first language. But if acquisition is delayed, the result may be the inadequate mastery observed in cases of language deprivation. So when language is being deprived, the acquisition is delayed, sometimes of learning or how to acquire a language, because of the inadequate mastery observed in cases of language deprivation. So however, the plasticity hypothesis has been challenged by evidence that a degree of left hemisphere lateralization exists from birth. So furthermore, recent studies have identified cases of infants who have not recovered some aspects of their linguistic competence after left brain damage, and of adults who seem to have recovered their language by relocating it to their right hemisphere. In addition, we now have more evidence about right hemisphere damage. So while damage to the left hemisphere affects primary language functions such as syntax and lexis, so damage to the right appears to affect the processing of discourse. So the left would, if the left side of the brain is damaged, the left hemisphere, then that would disrupt your language functions. But if the right side is damaged, then that would affect the processing of discourse. Now, it also seems that while phoneme level processing is chiefly the prerogative of the left hemisphere, the processing of suprasegmental features, especially prosody, takes place on the right. So suprasegmental features always would take place on the right, while the left hemisphere would deal with the prerogatives. So one current view of lateralization issue is thus that the right hemisphere would specialize in more rapid language operations, and the right in those connected to higher level meaning processes. So this division of functions makes sense when the brain has to deal with two closely associated processes, such as processing phonemes, the left side, and prosody on the right side. So it also accords with evidence from modern imaging techniques showing that language is much more widely distributed in the brain than the original lateralization hypothesis supposed. So what we would say that the division of functions that would make sense in the brain, they have to deal with two closely associated processes. One would be the phonemes on the left side and the prosody on the right side. So it will also account with evidence from modern imaging techniques showing that language is much more widely distributed in the brain than the original lateralization hypothesis supposed. So it may be that human brain is more flexible than once believed, even in adulthood, when the critical period is long over. So we can say that yes, maybe the human brain is more flexible than once believed, even in the adulthood when the critical period is long over. In the exceptional circumstances of simultaneously translation, some professionals would appear to distribute their two operating languages between the two hemispheres, usually reserving the left of the native language and the right for the second language. So in this way, they keep their language apart and manage to cope with the lack of synchronicity between the incoming auditory signal and the outgoing translation. So again, the key seems to be the need to keep two closely associated operations distinct, to keep them separate, to make them differentiate with each other. So it was once believed that lateralization might be peculiar to human beings and afford an explanation of why language is unique to our species. So however, an enlarged left hemisphere has been found to occur in other species, including birds. So frogs have a dominant hemisphere also, which appears to be associated with croaking, the sound that the frog makes, the croaking sound. So this suggests that across species, the larger side of the brain has special functions related to vocalization and the processing of rapid auditory stimuli. Brain localization. Now, we are going to study about localization. Now, what is brain localization? Now, early research suggested that there are two areas of the brain which are closely associated with language. Broca's area, you can see Paul Broca, it lies just in front and above the left ear. So it would be right in front and above the left ear on this area. That would be your Broca area. Now Wernicke's area is just above and behind the left ear. So that would be this part. So this would be the Broca and that would be the Wernicke area. So attention was first drawn to these parts of the brain by the aphasic effects, which were noted when they suffered damage. So how we found out about this was through different, when people were getting affected through the aphasic effects, then these you could see that they suffered when they were suffering some damage in these areas. Then we could see how it affected the human processing. So generalizing considerably. Now the Broca's aphasia appeared to give rise to problems of syntax, while Wernicke's aphasia resulted in problems of lexis and of comprehension. So we have studied this before, that Broca's aphasia affected the syntax of a language, and Wernicke's aphasia affected the lexis and comprehension of a language. So the understanding. So however, the effects of damage now varied greatly in type and degree between patients, suggesting a more complex state of affairs. So it is also, of course, dangerous to theorize about normal processing on the basis of evidence from medical cases. So recently, brain imaging methods have added greatly to our knowledge. Language appears to be widely distributed throughout the brain. A critical role is played by the system of massive interconnections, which enables information to be transmitted rapidly from one part to another part of the brain. So what we're doing is, like when they started taking brain imaging, they saw that language appeared widely distributed throughout the brain. So a critical role was played by the system of massive interconnections between the neurons, which enables information to be transmitted rapidly from one part of the brain to another part of the brain. Now, this is evidence that the classic language areas, Broca's and Wernicke's, are points where various language processes overlap. Their vulnerability, that means their weak points, thus lies in the fact that many processes pass through them. So that's why they are vulnerable. So language appears to be organized hierarchically, with the central parts of the brain looking after more rapid analytic operations and the outer looking after slower associative operations. So there appear to be distinct language processes according to the physical form of the signal, or speech versus writing. So in the way in which the signal is to be handled. Now, for example, repeating words, finding vocabulary, associating meaning, and whether production or reception is involved. So it's speech versus writing, and then how the different signals are handled, how repeating words would be handled, how finding vocabulary would be possible, associating meaning by retrieving words from our storage, and whether production or reception would be involved. So low-level listening is not as closely connected to speech as some hypotheses. So some people hypothesized that low-level listening would be closely connected to speech, which was not true. Now, there is evidence that, at least in detecting errors, there are strong links between syntax and semantics. Activities involving the form of words, for example, mnemonic tasks, they seem to activate different parts of the brain from those involving word meaning. So it does activate the different parts of the brain then of those parts of the brain that are only associated with finding the meaning of words. So grammar appears to be widely distributed throughout the brain also. Now, function words are stored and processed separately from lexical words. Now, they seem to be processed rapidly, perhaps so as to provide a syntactic frame for the sentence. Now, regular past forms seem to be processed morphologically, while irregular ones are processed as lexical items. So comparative studies of aphasia across languages suggest that syntactic parsing draws on different areas of the brain according to whether a language is heavily dependent upon word order, like in English, or on morphology, like in Italian language. So English speakers suffer especially as a result of damage to Broca's area, Italian as a result of the damage to Wernicke's area. So people who speak English, if the Broca area is damaged, then they would suffer in speaking English language. But if you're a native Italian speaker, then if the Wernicke's area is damaged, only then would your Italian be affected. So hence a view that language processes map in an opportunistic way onto whichever brain functions best supports them. So that is clear that a language process would map the opportunistic way of whatever function would support them best, they will turn towards that. So broad class transcription. Now what is broad class transcription? It's a transcription which features only the most general phonemic or phonetic cues which are taken to be present in the speech signal. So it's a transcription which features only the most general phonemic and phonetic cues that would be available in the speech signal. Now a broad class transcription might characterize words in terms of the manner of articulation of their constituent phonemes and nothing more. So one purpose of using a transcription of this kind is to establish how much information is necessary for a listener to uniquely identify a particular word. So one purpose of this transcription would be to find out or establish how the information is necessary for a listener and how it uniquely identifies a particular word. So the buffer. Now what is the buffer zone? Now speech needs to be pre-assembled in chunks of several words before we produce it. So only in this way could we impose intonation patterns upon an utterance. So speech would need to be pre-assembled in chunks of several words before we can produce the speech. So only in this way can we impose intonation patterns upon an utterance. So if there is, therefore, assume that the speaker has some kind of mental buffer in which to store a blueprint of each upcoming utterance prior to articulation, the term is borrowed from the buffer in which a PC stores information ahead of printing it. Without such a resource, we would be incapable of producing connected speech as fluently as we do. So, what goes into the buffer at this final stage of planning must be extremely detailed, or there may be several buffers operating in parallel. So Levitt in 1989 describes a phonetic plan which assembles the entire set of articulatory gestures which are necessary in order to produce the target words. So in addition, intonation, lexical stress, word order, etc. must be fully specified prior to the articulation. So we could say that the intonation, the rise and fall of the voice, the lexical stress, how we put stress on our different words, vocabulary words, and the word order, they would be fully specified prior to or before articulation. So according to Levitt, he said that the phonetic plans would assemble the entire set of the articulatory gestures and in order to produce the target words. Now a further function of a speech buffer is to enable the pre-assembled sequence to be reviewed at the last possible moment before it triggers articulation. So evidence from self-correction data indicates that speakers not only monitor their utterances at the time they are producing them, but also subject them to a final check immediately before speaking. So writers appear to need a similar storage process so that to that of speakers. So while Dickens was penning the line, it was the best of times. He must have had the rhetorical structure of the whole sentence already marked out. With the reprieve, it was the worst of times already available as a pretext. So this is uncertainty as to the form that written language takes when it is stored in this way. So both reading and writing appear to have a strong phonological component. It may well be that words in the writing buffer are stored in some kind of quasi-phonological form as inner speech. In this case, there may be a separate buffer dedicated to the lower level process of the assembling of the graphemes. So we move on to capacity theories then. Now in capacity theories, theories based on a view saying that the processing of linguistic information is affected by the limitation of the human processor. So these theories, the capacity theories, would say that the linguistic information is affected by how a human what limitations are put on the human processing language. Now the constraints on performance are usually said to derive from our limited working memory capacity, which determines the amount of information we can process at any given time, and or the number of processes that we can apply to. So if one task demands great resources of attention, it restricts the amount of working memory that is available for performing tasks or performing others. So thus, if a reader has to focus a great deal of attention upon decoding the words on the page, then she has very limited resources to spare for building the words into higher level meaning. So that means their resources are not strong enough, and they can't build a low level word into a high level meaning. So it is advantageous for us to develop a high degree of automaticity in performing tasks such as decoding. So automatic processes make few demands upon working memory, leaving us with ample capacity for other operations. So child-directed speech, now that would be the CDS. Child-directed speech, a speech register used by adults when addressing infants, also known as motherese, parentese, caretaker talk, baby talk. Now parents simplify their speech in consistent ways when speaking to children. For English speakers, now the linguistic modifications would include phonological features, that's simplification, higher pitch, emphatic stress, greater pausing, longer pauses, a slower speech rate. That would be for the phonological features. Then lexical features, restricted vocabulary, local topics, special forms. Syntactic features. Now syntactic features would be shorter utterances, less complex utterances. So in addition, CDS is characterized by less defluency than adult speech and much repetition and rephrasing. So we can say that it would be with less disfluency and then it would be with adult people speaking, and it uses much rephrasing and repetition. So it may employ its own lexical variants, pedibys. Many of these modifications now potentially assist the child in the bootstrapping process of identifying words and recognizing phrase boundaries, or in making matches between words and objects in the real world. So, however, in the light of Chomsky's poverty of stimulus argument, the major issue is whether CDS is accurate, explicit, and comprehensive enough to provide the infant with the data it needs in order to acquire a language. So we would say that according to Chomsky's poverty stimulus, the argument would be that can CDS accurately work to supply a child or provide a child with all the data that the child needs for learning a language, or it can't. So that would be a main issue. So in fact, CDS is not as degenerate as Chomsky argued. It is generally well formed syntactically, though it contains more imperatives and questions than normal conversation. So while nativists are correct in asserting that adults rarely correct infant language, a great deal of indirect teaching takes place when parents echo, so revise or expand their child's utterances. So parents also support acquisition with scaffolding, where the adults initiating utterance provides a syntactic and lexical framework for the infant's responses. So you want milk, you want juice, you want milk or juice. Furthermore, it would appear that adults fine-tune their CDS as the child's understanding of language progresses. So they undertune their qualities because the language is progressing in a child, and the child is learning day by day. So CDS thus provides a richer source of linguistic data than was once assumed. So, however, it has proved difficult to establish precisely how the modifications to adult speech assist the infant. So no correlation has been found between the degree of simplification in the carrier's CDS and the rate at which the infant requires language. So furthermore, CDS does not appear to be universal. In non-Western societies, it may have different characteristics also. So there are even cultures in which a child is exposed to adult discourse, but no language is specifically directed towards it. So no language is directed towards the child, but a child would be exposed to adult discourse or adult conversation. So within a given culture, CDS is strikingly consistent across carriers, suggesting either that it is transmitted as folk knowledge, or that the speaker somehow taps into their own experience of language acquisition. So similarities have been traced between CDS, foreigner talk, and some Pidgins and Creoles. So one nativist view holds that in constructing any of these forms, speakers draw upon an innate sense, an inbuilt sense of what constitutes the basic properties of a language. So this may be a relic of the universal grammar, or which enables us to acquire our first language. So maybe we can use this as a universal grammar relic, and it can help us in acquiring our first native language or learning the language. Then we move on to child grammar. Now, child grammar, the notion that the grammar of a language acquiring infant may have its own internal consistencies, and that we should approach it on its own terms rather than by reference to the norms of adult grammar. So syntactic analysis of the infant's early two-word utterances, example, more nut, to sock represented as NP, modifier N, was found to be insufficiently informative. The researchers therefore argued for a richer interpretation using semantic criteria. Now, it was concluded that three language functions predominated in the earliest two word utterances. First nomination, naming, using nouns and deictic terms, this, here, already used singly. Then recurrence, expressed by terms such as more and another. Then non-existent, expressed by terms such as all gone, no. So syntactic patterns in the later two word utterances were subclassified to show the semantic relationships involved. So for example, modifier head could be interpreted as attributive, big doggy, possessive, daddy shoe, or recurrent, more up. So Chimp Studies then, if you further go on to see Chimp Studies, a number of projects have investigated whether other primates, especially chimpanzees, can acquire language if properly taught. Now, positive evidence would have important implications for nativist theories of language acquisition by humans. So if chimps can be shown to recognize semantic categories like food and to apply syntactic patterns, for example, word order, then it might suggest that they too have access to the basic principles underlying the language. So this would then lend itself to one of the three interpretations. So chimps share the human language mechanism in some form, but lack a genetically transmitted trigger which sets it off as part of maturation. So there is no innate mechanism peculiar to human beings. Acquiring a language depends upon the input a child receives. So language maps on established cognitive operations which human beings share with other primates.